Oh, that's fucking chunky.
Wow, that's just slurping like crazy. The rest of them are all doing fine.
Just the one in the cardboard.
It's the one in the cardboard that's getting the most air bubbles pulled out of cardboard, I'm imagining.
Alright, so done all of my molds just the previous night, wherein I used the container of all that chopped up silicone I made. I've got some extra chunks in there, and I'll play some B-roll of that, I suppose. But we are now going to open up, rather I am going to open up all these molds I already made, and I popped a couple of them open, or at least took them out of the mold jackets, or sleeves, or whatever you want to call them, the tubes, and I want to see how they turned out. Maybe do a quick test casting on a few of them, just to see if there's any imperfections I can't see at a glance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that technique, but for now I've got molds to open. There we go. So one of the things I will say about doing this PVC pipe mold jacket is that it really gets jammed in there, and so you need to kind of be able to get it started a little bit so you can then wiggle it out from the bottom. But I mean, turns out some really perfect results, so that's going to be a lot more reusable and a lot more durable than the cardboard tubes I was using before, and a little bit easier to come by, considering one 10-foot length of PVC pipe is going to produce dozens of little mold tubes at that size, plus you can get it in almost any diameter you need. But now the question is, how well do they cast? Because what I ended up doing, as I explained earlier, and I will probably have to re-record later, was these molds were made with a certain portion of chopped up and repurposed silicone molds that I had essentially deemed unusable or not worth continuing using, because they had imperfections or defects, or they were wearing out. Using the chopped up silicone as a filler, it just more or less occupies the negative space that's present whenever you make a mold. Because what you end up with is you got floor of your mold, you got your tube, you know, your mold box, and you got your dude in there. And really, all you need is sort of this immediate space around it. You got all your other silicone in there. And normally when you pour silicone, you fill it all up, and it fills the negative space and the important detail space and everything else, you know, assuming you do it right and you don't end up with air bubbles in there. But what happens when you're using the silicone as a filler, the chopped up silicone, you're getting all these little lumpy bits in there that kind of take up that extra space. So you end up needing way less silicone, and the fresh stuff will still settle around the piece, so you still end up with that super nice barrier, the inside wall of your mold ends up still looking fine, but all of the other stuff, like, you know, there's nothing up here that you need to worry about. Like, you're not molding off of that
So filling that space with the chopped up silicone is just saving you material. So you have to buy less silicone, so you're saving a little bit of money. When you're doing very small scale stuff like I am, when you're an amateur, or when you're, you know, just trying to learn the hobby, refine your skills and such, it's a nice way to at least make sure that any mess ups or any mistakes, any molds that came out less than perfect because maybe you didn't stir it well enough, or you stirred it too much and had too many air bubbles, or you don't have a vacuum chamber so you didn't have any way to degas it, you can end up with bad molds. Or you can just use a mold so much that it wears out and all the fine details are getting ripped out with each pull. Either way, all this recycled silicone stuff is, long and short, a means of reclaiming old silicone that's otherwise not being used. Like, I could chop this up and that could be used as filler for another set of molds. What I would say, just based on a preliminary glance on a couple of these, I think I saw some lumps that don't look promising, but all I can really do now is test them out.
We're just going to pour a bunch of this and see how it turns out. Air bubbles shouldn't be too bad, but you never know. I mostly want to try and see if all of these came out the way I intended. Alright, so anyways, final thoughts. Whole idea here, what I was trying to test was how well the recycled silicone technique works, right? Because you can end up with bad molds, or molds with air bubbles, molds that have worn out, molds that weren't made correctly, and so you end up with big chunks of silicone. Should also mention, you can run into situations where you mix way too much silicone and you end up with a cup full of junk that is just wasted. It's not even a mold, it's just junk. So what you can do is chop it up like this, and I would maybe suggest chopping it up as fine as you can. Maybe don't use a blender. Avoid any of these little skin-like super thin chunks. I don't think those are going to work best for your situation, but you can chop up these old molds for whatever reason you might have them, and when you are mixing up a new batch of silicone, literally just take a scoop and add it in there, and it will make the whole mix a lot more chunky, but it's a filler that's going to take up all of that otherwise unnecessary void space that normally just takes up your silicone. So in that way you can use less silicone but still make normal size molds. Or rather, make a full complete mold without having to make a more complex mold box or whatever. It's a means of saving money and getting your money back, I suppose, for any silicone you've already used and mixed. Now this method does have some difficulties in that when you're making small stuff like I am, you end up with a very tiny amount of space between the mold wall and the piece that you're molding. So if your chunks are too big, they're going to plug up your mold and they're not going to fall into place properly, and they're maybe going to trap air bubbles in there, which is why I would also suggest, if you're going to do this, have a vacuum chamber, have a silicone that takes a while to set. I use smooth cast, where'd it go? Here we go. I use, not smooth cast rather, but Mold Star 15 Slow. This has a working time of about an hour, and that's plenty of time for you to pour your A and B, mix that up thoroughly, degas that. Then you can add in your additives if you feel like you don't have enough for what you're doing, and then degas that, and then pour that into your mold box and everything. And then the step I would suggest after that, and this is a step I've started doing with the vacuum chamber whenever I'm making molds, is to then degas your silicone in the mold box on your piece, so it will naturally draw in all of the new silicone, the fresh silicone, down around the piece, so you end up with like a nice, clean, air bubble free casting. And you can even see with this guy that I didn't get any air, like any bubbles trapped in the eyes or in the mouth. I believe these little air bubbles down here were part of the pouring process. You can actually maybe check on that other one in a second, see how that came out. That's maybe just something if I need to give my mold a little shake just to be safe, or I need to degas my resin. Both possible. But either way, the fresh liquid silicone will be drawn down and it'll settle mostly around the figure, and then all of your little chunks will fill the space around it, so you don't need to really worry about using as much silicone. So you can get more uses out of one kit or one pot or whatever, and so you can get more done with less material. The only thing I would say is that it's a little labor intensive to do, so it's maybe something that you need to set aside the time to do, not something you want to be doing as you're mixing your silicone. So, you know, don't mix your part A, part B, and then grab your leftover chunk of silicone that you intend to chop up and fill stuff in with. Of course, sort of depending on the size of what you're doing, if you're doing a much larger piece, and allow me to illustrate, if you're doing a much larger piece where you have, we'll just say like a sword. Maybe one day I will cast a sword. But if you're doing a much larger piece and you've got your big mold box there, smaller mold box than that, you could even, say, trim off those and have a very tight mold that follows the contour. So you really only need to fill in all this area. That's still going to be a lot of silicone. But say you've got lots of leftover chunks, lots of, whatever got left at the bottom of the bucket, old molds and such. You could chop those up into fairly big chunks and just throw those in there and displace enough of that silicone that, say you pour it all out and it doesn't fully fill the box, you can start filling that in with other chunks of silicone, and that will make it rise, and that will cover your piece, and then you'll be good to go on making your mold. I have done that with some of the other larger molds I've made, to where you end up with sort of these gap areas where you know, clear you need the silicone there to sort of support the shape of the overall mold, but you can still just lop off a big chunk of something like that, and nah, I'm not gonna do that right now, but just slot that in there. Of course, being careful to degas your mold as it's before it's completely set and all that. But yeah, it's the general idea, and it's the same thing I've tried doing with the leftover chunks of resin, because I have a habit of saving those too. Is that you can use that as a space filler. Resin will generally always want to stick to resin as long as it's not coated in anything or has any leftover residue on it or whatever. And silicone will likewise always want to stick to silicone. So kind of using that, you can recombine cured silicone and fresh silicone and cured resin and fresh resin, and they will naturally bond together. It's not always the greatest thing. What can end up happening is, say, if you've got these colorful chunks, so you can end up with just a fragment sticking up in the surface. It won't be popping out of the mold, but it will have a discolored edge showing. Or you can also run into the issue of getting an air bubble trapped in there. It's sort of iffy. Depends on the size of what you're working on. Don't recommend doing it always, but it is a possibility. And because resin and silicone do have shelf lives, not that I would recommend doing this every time either, you could, for instance, just pour a large batch of very small figurines, or beads, or whatever. Like, these guys are even smaller than these guys, who are even smaller than... Just gonna pop him out and take a look at him. Or even smaller than these guys. So I could, for instance, pop him in the mold, and that is solid, usable resin. Pour something on, pour something on top of that, and because of the displaced space in there, I will need even less resin to fill that mold. And if, for instance, I just decided that, pop him out of there. Come on. If I decide that, you know what, this guy's not very good, I'm never going to sell him, I'm never going to do anything with him, recycle him back in, he's now filler for another piece. And likewise, I could take a whole handful of gondolas and throw them in a larger resin cast piece, and they would just become a solid part of the larger whole. Or you can also do cool stuff where you take, solid color piece like that and put it inside a semi-transparent or in an opaque. I'm mixing up my words here, and I'm just talking randomly. But you kind of get the idea. It is using less material by displacing the material that you are mixing fresh with old material. Recycling, essentially. But mostly just sort of fusing together what's already been cured with what you are curing at the moment, if that makes any sense. Either way, I'm going to see about making 2 more big molds, see if I can do enough of these clear glossy guys, which honestly just look fantastic with the mica powder and the Smoothcast 326 and 325. That's how you get that sort of opaque color. Or no, not opaque. Translucent, transparent, mix it all up. Anyways, yeah, I'm going to see about making some more molds, and because these are much larger molds, but because I've got a much bigger gap here, using this stuff is going to be great for only having to mix a tiny bit of silicone and still being able to fill what is, 5-6 times bigger than some of these tiny molds I've already made. So, as always, thank you for watching. If this was at all interesting or educational or useful, let me know. Tell me in the comments. Tell me on Instagram. I'm on Twitter now, at Mr_GearGrinder, Mr_GearGrinder. Instagram at GearGrinder Designs. I'm just going to put that all up on the screen down here-ish. And yeah, I'm making an attempt to be more active, and
with any luck, I will have enough of these dudes made at some point in the near future that they will be sold in some capacity. Thinking of doing like a blind bag scheme where you get so many of them in a bag and they will be random colors, and you'll get maybe a couple of the really fancy ones like that and some flat colors and maybe a big one. I don't know, still gotta work it out. Some of these are a lot easier to cast than others, this guy for instance. So I'm gonna leave you with me struggling to open this mold just to see if it's still remotely good. Thanks for watching. God damn it. Yeah, this mold's gonna wear out really fast. Ugh. Hey, so there you go.